Hello, everybody. It is Saturday, August 17th, supposedly the dog days of August, where nothing much happens. But there's a lot happening in America on the political front, of course. The New York Times today has a new uh, poll out suggesting that Harris now has put the four Sunbelt states into play. I'm not sure what exactly it tells us, maybe demography, political ideology. Certainly the issue of minority voters and their attitude to Harris is important. We are in real time, I think, seeing the emergence, if not of Harris as a major political figure, of Harrisism. Maybe that's my term. I'm not sure whether other people think of it in those ways. An old friend of the show, uh, David Masciotra, is also a keen observer of Harris and Harrisism. He writes a monthly column for Salon. He's been on the show before as the author of a very important new book, Exerbia Now, the Battleground of American Democracy. And David is joining us from his home in Highland, Indiana. David, is there such a thing as Harrisism? Is that a conceit of mine, or is there something there?
No, I'm not sure if I would use that term, but you're striking at a reality that confronts us. It's almost as if uh, the political gods wanted to promote my book, because if viewers go back and watch when we talked about Exerbia Now, one of the theses of my book is that there's a collision between the residents of Exerbia, these towns on the fringes of cities, which are predominantly white, culturally conservative, disproportionately religious.
Yeah, and this was episode 2017 of Keen On. The title, we came up with the title, David Masciotra finds the pathologies of American totalitarianism in Exerbia.
That's right.
Maybe also the pathologies of American democracy.
That's right. And what's going on there is it's reactionary against demographic changes in American culture, increasing secularism in American culture, and social liberalism. And Harris, who doesn't have a wildly distinguished political career, is functioning as an avatar for those latter trends that I identified. And the circumstances surrounding her emergence as the nominee enhanced her status in that regard, because it was almost as if she was rescuing us from this dreary race between Donald Trump, nearly 80 years old, already tried to steal an election. Who knows what he'll do if he regains power, excuse me. And Joe Biden, who's been a decent president, but clearly no longer has what it takes to govern for another
Our
4 years.
shelf life. David, you use the term avatar.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me, again, that Harris is riding a wave of history. We need Marx around, perhaps, to put it in poetic language. A lot of people have talked about Harris and Harrisism as a kind of meme. It seems as if the spirit of, particularly of TikTok, has merged with the Harris campaign to produce a new kind of phenomenon. Is there any truth to that?
Absolutely. So there's a couple things going on. I would say that in some ways she's a continuation of Obama. Barack Obama is an immeasurably influential president in a cultural sense. In many ways, Donald Trump was a backlash against Obama. And now you have someone who's attempting to galvanize and excite the same coalition of voters that propelled Obama into the White House, but she's doing so with contemporary methodology, and that's what you rightfully identify as TikTok and social media.
But David, the Obama comparison is one that's being made continually, both by analysts, writers, critics, supporters, and I think even the Harris campaign. But 12 years are several centuries when it comes to American politics. Hasn't America changed dramatically in demographic terms, in cultural terms, in political terms since Obama left office?
Yes, and those changes have bolstered the political trends that put Obama in the White House and make Harris's ascent likelier than they would have been 12 years ago or even 4 years ago. The point that I was going to make is that it kind of speaks to your question. Obama's methods, even though he looked like a new candidate and in many ways was a new candidate, his methods were old-fashioned. He relied upon a certain blending of poetic and professorial rhetoric. He tried to speak to a middle America, middle in terms of ideology, whereas Harris is rhetorically a lightweight in comparison to Obama, and therefore offers these truncated speeches made to go viral on TikTok, on X,
Is
on
that
Facebook.
fair? I keep on interrupting you, David, but you're a big boy. You can deal with it. Is that fair? Is she really a lightweight version? They seem to have fairly similar backgrounds, from mixed cultural background, both very successful academically, both successfully networked individuals. Why do you say she's a lightweight?
Well, thank you for the interruption. I don't mean that she's a lightweight intellectually or professionally. And I would never characterize her in that derogatory manner. I said rhetorically, maybe lightweight was the wrong term, but I'll rephrase. Rhetorically, what she is offering is much simpler and much more palatable to a wider audience than what Obama did in 2008 and 2012. Obama was expecting people to sit for rather lengthy policy addresses and to listen to his disquisition on American history. Whereas Kamala Harris is, and I don't believe she's doing this because she's incapable of doing otherwise, she's doing it because she's making a tactical decision, is speaking to the tenor of our times by offering abridged speeches that can go viral in social media bites and clips. And what we're seeing is a much thinner version of what Obama offered. I don't think it's because she's a lightweight. That's not how I meant the term, and I appreciate you giving me the chance to correct it. I think because she's making a tactical decision that is prudent, given the ways in which social media has changed our culture, shortening attention spans.
Right. It's the speed that seems
yes
so relevant. The Turflers, of course, wrote that famous book on speed back in the 20th century, but it's astonishing how fast now things change. It was only a few weeks ago you wrote a very interesting salon essay. I think it was from the end of July, about the week of the Trump assassination attempt, and you define that the week America was undoubtedly at its worst. It was a very depressing week on lots of levels, especially
yes.
for American progressives like you. And now everything has changed. I mean, it's almost as if, David, that week hadn't happened. Is this just unique, do you think, to this bizarre election of 2024? Or does it reflect this new reality of American politics, that things just changed absolutely dramatically from week to week? You mentioned Obama. Obama was a different kind of figure, but I don't remember in Obama changing everything overnight on a weekly or bi-weekly basis.
And also, when Obama ran in 2008, events still mattered. And it almost seems now as if we're entering a strange, vexing era of politics in which events don't matter for more than half a day's news cycle. I mean, an assassination attempt I was writing that essay you just mentioned in response to the assassination attempt and in response to what I deemed quite a stupid and short-sighted media reaction to that attempt. An assassination attempt 10, 20 years ago would dominate the news cycle for weeks, maybe even months. Now it's as if, like you said, the thing barely even happened. And we've gone from, and of course, part of this is a major part of it is because Biden withdrew, and now we have Kamala Harris as the nominee who's generated immeasurable enthusiasm. We've gone from almost accepting that there was nothing anyone could do to prevent Trump from regaining power to it looking like Trump is now the underdog. And as his campaign's imploding and the Vance pick looks worse by each day, and Harris garners more and more excitement and support, it's her race to lose. So the breakneck speed at which things occur is enough to give one whiplash.
I wonder whether this is also bound up in Trump himself or the phenomenon of Trumpism. I've always thought, rather than some sort of fascist, that he's a reality television star who's brought the aesthetics of reality television to politics. So there's always a cliffhanger. There's always the next episode. And in an odd kind of way, the assassination attempt on Trump seems to me to just fit into reality television. If this narrative was being scripted, this is exactly what would have happened, which in a way makes it so unsurprising. Am I over theorizing here, David?
Well, I would say I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. Trump's politics are certainly authoritarian, as are those of his closest allies and most fervent supporters. But yes, he's first and foremost a showman who brings the aesthetics and tactics of reality TV to the political campaign. And it is like the assassination attempt ended one season, and we have a new main character in the next season, and that's Kamala Harris. And Joe Biden is a character who's now faded into the background. It does appear that way, and that's also why we're getting off the subject, I guess, a bit, but that's why when people say, oh, Donald Trump needs to talk about policy, they're deceiving themselves, they're fooling themselves, because I don't think Trump has any interest in talking about policy. He barely talked about policy when he was president of the United States. He prefers the theatrical presentation, the showmanship, the tactics and methods of a television program. And his policy knowledge is about as deep as I once had a friend pour me a shot of absinthe in something that contained less than 1.5 ounces, a standard whiskey or liquor shot size. That represents Trump's policy interest and knowledge, that shot of absinthe. So we are in a strange new era in which things like policy and things like political events no longer rate in comparison to personality, made for TV storylines, and things of that nature. It's as if we're all living in a television studio.
I know you're in the process of writing an essay on David Foster Wallace for our friends at Liberty's Quarterly, a big supporter of our show. This is an America that Wallace warned us about, or at least imagined, wasn't it?
That's exactly it. And that's the crux of my essay, is that very few critics view Wallace as a political writer because he almost never directly addressed politics. But he warned pretty prophetically and brilliantly, and often hilariously, about what would happen if America continued to allow an entertainment ethos to dominate all aspects of its life. I mean, that's a major part of his most famous novel, Infinite Jest.
And he
That's
wasn't certainly the first person to make that argument. There's, of course, the famous book "Entertaining Ourselves to Death." So,
amusing ourselves to death.
sorry,
Yes,
"Amusing
Neil
Ourselves to
Postman.
Death." The Postman book, which argues at the beginning a brilliant first few paragraphs that we got our 20th century dystopia wrong. It wasn't 1984, it was Brave New World. And I think that book seems even more relevant today. And as you say, Wallace as working in that tradition too.
And I'll remind some of the viewers that the president in Infinite Jest is a man by the name of Johnny Gentle, who was a lounge singer and TV personality who would croon through debates and use the skills he acquired working TV audiences and lounge audiences to duck any substantive questions about policy. And he's essentially a buffoon who manages to make his audience laugh, and that's how he acquires power. And in 2016, I remember vividly people on television, but also everyday voters I would meet talking about how Trump was entertaining, and they saw that as appealing in juxtaposition with the very policy-oriented, politically calculating
But
Hillary
again, it's
Clinton.
not just Postman and Wallace. I mean, there's another classic movie, Being There, which actually in some ways predicts Trump exactly. A man who spends his whole time watching television, which is what
Yes,
Trump is.
and Gore Vidal, I often would write about the danger that would arise if entertainment and reactionary politics ever
Is
coalesced.
Harris then part of this, do you think, in her ability to use, or her aides, her campaign's use of the internet, of memes, of TikTok, short videos? Is she, for better or worse, a prisoner of technology, as Postman predicted, I guess, as Wallace and so many of these other rather dark writers and thinkers on America predicted?
Yes, I don't think there's any escape from it. Even something as, for example, Harris and Walls, and I think it was her running mate Tim Walls who kind of coined it, referring to Trump, Vance, and the right wingers gathering around them as weird. I got into a disagreement with a novelist by the name of Joe Perry, a very good writer, who she's offended by this weird insult because she sees it as juvenile and a schoolyard tactic. And that, of course, it is. But I was trying to tell her, that's just life in the big city now. They've created a term that allows them to, again, go viral and succeed in the new within the new architecture of how discourse functions. Ideally, I would like to see a rigorous, robust policy debate without personal insults. But unfortunately, that's no longer the world in which we live. And so many American citizens are checked out from the substance of politics. I mean, surveys show that a majority of Americans can't even name all three branches of government. The consequence, therefore, is that things like weird and things like 12-second clips on Instagram or TikTok are the new lingua franca.
Are the new normal. I mean,
Are the new
it'll be
normal.
interesting to see in the Chicago convention upcoming. David, you wrote an interesting piece earlier this year for the Washington Monthly about Hillary Clinton as a truth teller. What Harris and Clinton, of course, have in common is that they are the first women to run for president. Neither of them are president yet. And what about the gendered quality of Harris? Does it have any significance? You mentioned Waltz, her VP pick. It seems to me, at least, as if she chose Waltz over Shapiro because Waltz is less uppity and he's willing to take a clear second place in the relationship. Does this suggest something different about gender? There's been a lot of interesting commentary on the role of gender, or perhaps the absence of gender now in this election.
So Hillary Clinton had to, well, essentially for her entire political career, she had to fight various forms of sexism and chauvinism. And those things played a massive part in the 2016 campaign. The electorate has changed significantly in 8 years, so it won't play as much of a part in this campaign. I don't think, for example, referring to women as nasty in the chauvinistic way that Trump does will resonate with as many voters now as it did in 16. But we do see a double standard at work in certain criticisms that are levied against Harris. For example, the focus on her laugh. I think there's a gender dimension.
That was the headline of your Salon piece. The weird and sexist criticism of Kamala's cackle.
Yes. So you had a guest on your program a few weeks ago, Professor Niobe Way. And
who's written a book about the challenge of young men and women. We've done young men and boys in America today of escaping the conventions of manliness. We've also did a show last year with Richard Reeves, whose book on men and boys is a huge success. So we've dealt with it. So, but coming back to this issue, Ezra Klein had an interesting podcast from the New York Times on manliness in the upcoming election. Ross Douthat from the right also argues that masculinity is on the ballot. Is this an election about gender? The Republicans will try to create a lot of panic around fertility. J.D. Vance fetishizes the family, the trans issue, of course. Are we beyond gender, or certainly feminism? Is masculinity the new feminism?
I think that masculinity is in a state of panic because as women become more present in positions of power, and the culture in many ways shifts more toward what your former guest Niobe Way calls soft characteristics of leadership and communication. And that's what the Harris laugh represents, a softer approach to leadership. Not to say that she's soft. I mean, she was a prosecutor and a district attorney, but she communicates often in a softer way. Many men are having trouble making the adjustment. And the right wing, a reactionary political movement, is attempting to appeal to those men with some vague promise that they can resurrect the good old days when men were in charge and it was easier to get dates, things of that nature. We have this incel movement and all this anxiety surrounding men who consistently strike out, as it were. And I think that Trump, Vance, in different ways, speak to that anxiety surrounding cultural changes that place what was once known as masculine authority under threat. And of course, the irony is that Trump has come to represent some form of masculinity on the politics of the right. They impose his face over Rocky and Rambo.
And the convention using professional.
Yes, right. But Trump's behavior, contradicts every single idea about the old masculine virtues. Stoicism and grace under pressure, all the kinds of ideas we would associate with the work of Ernest Hemingway, whose writing on gender was much more complicated than people assume. But Trump's always whining and engaging in self-pity. But even still, he's somehow the candidate for those who long for the bygone days of masculine control and authority and a hierarchy where men sit at the top.
Was it their choice to use these professional wrestlers to introduce him? Was it a kind of Freudian slip on the part of Trump and his organizers? They should have got boxers. I mean, wrestling is about faking things, faking
Right,
fighting.
right.
And so, in a sense, with a nod and a wink, they're acknowledging the fakery of masculinity, of Trump's masculinity, of the ideal of masculinity.
Yeah, Hulk Hogan tearing open his shirt in character, speaking no differently than he would in the middle of the ring, cutting what in wrestling parlance they call a promo. I mean, that was a promo. That was a WrestleMania promo. And when I was a young boy and Hulk Hogan was in his prime, battling in the steel cage, I would go wild for that tearing open of the shirt, uh, because that to me represented masculinity. That represented strength. Of course, one grows older, more mature, and hopefully wiser, and learns that there's much more to it than that, and that's a cartoon. Uh, but it could have been a Freudian slip. There was a couple of things going on there. There's the Freudian slip of acknowledging the fakery of this cartoonish machismo, and then there's also what we were talking about a moment earlier, the entertainment ethos dominance of political discourse. I mean, could one imagine Hulk Hogan doing that routine at the convention for George W. Bush or even Ronald Reagan, who was a Hollywood actor? I mean, they would have been embarrassed. So these trends keep getting worse and worse and worse.
Well, that's not about worse and worse, different. So talking of these young men like yourself, looking for role models, anxious, lost, where should they look? You are the author of a book about Bruce Springsteen, working on a dream, the progressive political vision of Bruce Springsteen. You also wrote an interesting piece for Salon recently about what Bruce Springsteen can teach Republicans about small towns. Does Springsteen's philosophy and men like Springsteen offer a revised vision of masculinity for the 2020s?
I think so. Springsteen, probably because of his age, isn't going to become a role model to men in their teens or 20s. But Springsteen's work and the imagery surrounding his work, the poses that he often strikes, uh, has the appearance of traditional masculinity. But the work itself is much more complicated and much more nuanced. It puts forward an expression of tenderness that, to return to Niobe Way's language, combines the hard characteristics and the soft characteristics, and embraces emotional vulnerability, the willingness to express one's emotion, and never uh, places women on an inferior plane. And then I should also add that Springsteen is pretty much a lifelong support for gay and transgendered people. So it's a masculinity that is secure enough to share power, share prominence, express tenderness, and through creativity and artistry, strike a pose of strength that isn't cartoonish like Hulk Hogan at the convention.
So, and this was the piece you wrote for Salon about how Springsteen and the left can reclaim and cultivate a vocabulary of patriotism. Should Harris be listening to Springsteen, or at least Springsteen's politics, in terms of trying to seize the flag, if you like, so to speak, from Trump, and claiming to be more patriotic, more American than Trump, who, in his obsession with the peculiarities of America, could be portrayed as being profoundly un-American.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, if of course people would disagree with me, perhaps it's a big country, but when I think of what makes me proud of the United States of America and what makes me feel uh, a sense of triumph in the American experiment, it's the freedom that it offers. It's the ability to expand that freedom and self-correct and include more and more people in the centrality of its movement. And it's a nation of immigrants. It's multicultural. There's a separation of church and state. Well, I mean, Bruce Springsteen's first and foremost a rock and roll musician, but his music and his activism offers an intelligent patriotism of self-awareness, recognizing the flaws of the country, but taking pride in the country's potential to correct those flaws, and recognizing that everyone from Amadou Diallo, who was an immigrant who police killed in a case of mistaken identity, he wrote a song about him called American Skin, to someone dying of AIDS. People who of that nature inspired the song Streets of Philadelphia and the film Philadelphia, to the small town factory worker in New Jersey, are equally part of the American experience and experiment. And I think that one of the most unfortunate things that's occurred in the past 10 to 20 years of American life is the right wing and the Republican Party has captured the flag, and almost made it a symbol of their brand of politics, to the extent that I personally know liberals who feel uncomfortable flying the flag because they don't want people to confuse them as Republicans. And to them, I say, get over it. You're being a little precious. But Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and the people who support her should attempt to recapture the flag with a mature patriotism that says we're the ones actually representing and trying to advance the ideals that made this country great: an expanding democracy, a nation of immigrants, the separation of church and state, and using the mechanisms of a constitutional frame of government to offer people more rights, more opportunities, and more hospitality.
If I had a Bruce Springsteen track, David, I would play it after that. But in all seriousness, you wrote a piece for Salon, again, not very long ago, in July, talking about Biden's, this was several histories ago now, Biden's debate crisis meeting liberal, what you call self-delusion. Should liberals, progressives be careful not to mistake the current political atmosphere as a victory as opposed to just something that accidentally blew in their direction?
Yeah, they have to be very careful. So there are a couple of things are going on. There are some cultural trends, as we were discussing earlier, that make this a very politically advantageous time, or I should say a potentially advantageous time for liberals. The country's becoming more diverse. As David Ferris, great political scientist, writes in his book, The Kids Are All Left.
Yeah, and we had you introduced me to David. We had David on the show a few months ago. We'll have to get him back too.
Yeah, and I should tell you, any of your viewers in the Chicagoland area, David Ferris and I are going to appear together in conversation at Printers Row Lit Fest on September 7th. I would love to see you there. But Ferris writes in his book, The Kids Are All Left, and he documents quite persuasively that younger generations of Americans are more liberal than previous generations, and they're unlikely to change. They're not going to become more conservative as they age. So Harris, in a way, going back to your question of Harrisism, is able to ride those waves. As the old cliche, the adage goes, sometimes history makes the man, or in this case, the woman, and sometimes the woman makes history. This is a time when history's making the woman. It's almost the perfect time for her to run for president. But the Republican Party and its attendant culture is heavily funded, and they're very adept and very adroit at using the system, which in many ways works to their advantage. The Electoral College works to their advantage. The disproportionate representation within the US Senate works to their advantage. They've gerrymandered many states so that the US House works to their advantage in many states. So one of the mistakes that liberals often make is they have such a focus on these cultural trends that are often working in their favor that they neglect the hard and dirty work of working within the political system and organizing voters at the local and state level. So they need not just blind themselves with this cultural euphoria, but apply what's favorable in the cultural euphoria to real on the ground activism in terms of organizing voters and trying to change political systems to their advantage. The courts, the state legislatures, city councils, school boards, things of that nature. Because I'll just say this to put a button on it, if they don't, we could risk seeing a repeat of what happened with Obama. Obama was president 8 years, and during those 8 years, Democrats lost historic ground at the state level and the local level. And it's for that reason that we find ourselves in this precarious position right now, partially for that reason.
Well, we will have to get you back, David, on the show when your piece about David Foster Wallace, I'm looking forward to that, comes out in Liberties. You're talking about a time when history makes the woman. Maybe we should change the word history to her story. Lots more to talk about, David. Congratulations on the new piece. And we will talk in the not too distant future, hopefully before the election. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I look forward to it.